Kingdom of Men by Tiffany Nicole Terry. Chapter 7. War. The following morning came too early for KaLeah. She tried to hide her face from the beams of sunlight streaming in through the windows, thoughts of Nicolot still clinging somewhere behind her eyes. Had she dreamt the encounter in the secret passageway? No, she remembered. It had been real. "Are you awake yet?" "Holy dragon's ghosts!" KaLeah scrambled up and out of bed, nearly tripping on a blanket that she'd wrapped around her leg in her sleep. "Amira, how did you get in here?" Nonchalantly, Amira raised her long purple gown to her knees and climbed up onto the tall bed. She plopped down, folded her gown around her legs, and smiled up at KaLeah. "There is a door connecting our rooms behind one of the tapestries." KaLeah calmed down her beating heart and unwrapped herself from the bedding. "We have to find something fun to do today," Amira said. KaLeah moaned, closed her eyes, and fell back down face first onto the bed. Amira started to shake KaLeah. "Come on, get up," she said. "I don't care what we do, but we can't just sit around. Let's start with breakfast." "KaLeah." KaLeah groaned again at the combination of Amira's whining and shaking. She finally rose to her feet and went to wash her face in the basin. The water was cold, and as soon as the fogginess of sleep was gone, she saw Nicolot's face again. KaLeah could still feel his hands on her, and she trembled. She smiled at Amira and silently hoped that they wouldn't see him today. The princess handed her the plain gray tunic, belt, and tight black pants that KaLeah had set out the night before. She decided to arm herself only with a knife and her belt, since they would be indoors and presumably out of harm's way. Once she dressed, Amira handed her the silver and ruby dragon pendant the nursemaids had placed on the table beside her bed after helping her out of her dress. "You have to wear this at all times," she said. KaLeah reluctantly took it from the child's small fingers and pinned it onto her tunic. She followed Amira down staircases and hallways toward the dining room. "KaLeah, have you had any more dragon dreams?" Amira asked. KaLeah hadn't thought about her dreams since becoming too preoccupied with Nicolot. She started to tell Amira that she hadn't had any more dreams when she heard a faint voice. KaLeah stopped suddenly and looked around the hallway. "KaLeah?" Amira said. "Why did you stop?" The whispers intensified, as if competing to be heard. KaLeah tried to focus but couldn't discern any words. "Do you hear something?" KaLeah asked. Amira started. She looked at KaLeah carefully, as if it were a trick question. "No," she finally answered. "Do you?" KaLeah's ears were starting to ring, and she realized that the whispers were in her mind, just as the phantom dragon's words had been. She put her hands over her ears in a futile attempt to respond to the rising volume. As quickly as the sound started, her ears popped, and the whispers stopped. "It's gone," KaLeah said, lowering her hands. "What was it?" Amira asked, deep concern furrowing her brow. KaLeah looked thoughtfully at the young princess standing below her on the stairs. "I don't know," she said, "but I'm sorry if I scared you." "That's okay," Amira said. "I know that you're special. You'll protect me." Although it was true that KaLeah had already protected the princess, it still struck her as a curious comment. She had never thought of herself as a protector. This was still also new to her. Before she could consider the comment or the strange sounds that had permeated her head, she heard men's voices float up from the bottom of the stairs, and KaLeah motioned for Amira to keep quiet so they could listen in. "You hear those voices, right?" KaLeah whispered. Amira nodded up at her with a knowing grin. "The assassins were wearing Lacedaemonian colors," said a calm, smooth voice. "But what motivation would King McRoth have in harming Amira or Nicolot?" The second voice was deeper. "He stands to win more from an alliance with us if Nicolot is alive." A third, softer voice added to the conversation. "The colors could have just been a ruse to trick us. They could be affiliated with either kingdom or just bandits looking for a ransom." The voices faded away, and KaLeah's curiosity drove her to follow them. "Do you want to see what's going on?" she whispered to Amira. "It'll be fun." Amira nodded her head and took KaLeah's hand. KaLeah reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. Down the hall, she could see General Joseph Array standing outside two doors being held open by royal guards. KaLeah watched as the three men she had overheard went through the doors along with other men coming from other areas of the castle. She could tell something important was happening and wished that she could follow them into the room. Instead, she and Amira walked slowly and casually toward the general. Nicolot suddenly stepped out from behind a corner at the end of the hallway, Lamone following closely at his heels. KaLeah's eyes met his, then she quickly looked away. It was too late to duck out of sight or turn around, so she held her head high and kept walking forward. General Array acknowledged the girls as they passed with a slight nod and a kind smile. KaLeah noticed that Nicolot made quick adjustments in his stride in order to nearly collide with her in the wide hallway. "Good morning, little sister. Favor KaLeah," he said, smiling at his sister. His sleeve was dangerously close to touching her shoulder as he passed them. KaLeah nodded, not knowing exactly if she should stop and curtsy, but not wanting to regardless. "Good morning," Amira chirped in reply. After a few steps, she asked KaLeah in a whisper, "What do you think they're doing?" "I believe they're meeting to discuss what to do about the recent abduction and the second failed attempt. I wish I could be in there." "Well, you're not allowed," Amira said, matter-of-factly. "You are the first woman to ever be named a bodyguard, and women are not allowed in the Legion." "Do you ever wonder why?" KaLeah asked as they continued on, heading down the longer route toward the dining hall. Amira shrugged. "We're not strong enough, I suppose." "That isn't true. I could defeat all the boys and most of the men in my village at simple sword play. I could outsmart them, outtrack and hunt, and work twice as hard as any at whatever task I took on. My father understood that and never limited me. Your father and brothers shouldn't limit you either. Who knows what you could be capable of if only given the right instruction and encouragement." Amira was quiet, lost in thought, as they entered the dining hall and then sat at the long wooden table. They were served a meal of eggs, meat, and sweet jam on toast. "But what else would I do?" she asked after the servers left them alone in the room. "I am a princess. I will learn things, marry into a partnership with a man, and have children of my own someday." "Is that what you want to do?" Amira took a long time to answer. After they both had taken a few more bites of their breakfast, she finally responded, "I do not know." Nicolot. Nicolot tried hard not to think about KaLeah, but in refusing his advances in the passageway, she had risen to a special place inside him. He wanted her like a man would want to tame a wild dragot. He felt alive with the prospect of a challenge and walked a little taller than he had in years. The best part was that he wouldn't let Lamone know about it until after he'd won KaLeah over. Lamone would be furious with jealousy. Nicolot tried not to smile as he met General Joseph Array in the hall outside the war room. "Good day, Prince Nicolot," General Array said loudly. People often cringed or jumped back in alarm when the general spoke. General Array would say, "I'm not loud. Weak people just have weak ears." Nicolot tried not to react to the jolt of volume. "Is it such a good day, General?" Nicolot asked. The large man with skin much darker than his own leaned forward to speak man to man. "There's talk of war, my prince," he said. "It's always good when your father's men talk of war." He winked. Lamone snickered behind Nicolot, and General Array's eyes went cold. He glared at Lamone for a moment, and then looked away from them both as they entered the war room. The war room was long and narrow, with a wooden table running the length of the windowless room. A line of lit candles down the center kept the room well lit. The walls were covered with maps of the three kingdoms on Naldash. Some were new, but others were yellow and frayed, with holes depicting regime movements from previous wars and battles. All 10 captains were in the room already, some seated and some standing along the walls, while soldiers and guards remained stationed outside the doors. Two guards closed the doors after Nick Lamone and the general entered the room. Nicola and Lamone joined King Orezus and Prince Bilex at the table. The king looked old, sitting at the end of the table with all the young, strong men before him. His dark black hair was more and more gray every day, and his beard was so thin Nicola could see his pale white skin through the whiskers. He wondered how his father would be able to handle another war. "Dear friends," King Orezus started, "we are here to discuss the recent attack on Prince Nicolat and Princess Amira. General Array, I know your opinions. Would you start, please?" "An honor, my lord," General Array boomed. All heads backed an inch away from him, as if he had shoved them away with his words. "First, there are the assassination attempts to discuss. An attack on our beloved leaders calls for immediate retaliation. The problem is that we are unsure if the attacks came from King Sarzo of Exteli or King Mikroth of Lysodania. There is also a chance that the assassins were from another source entirely. To delay action would signify doubt and uncertainty, which is exactly what we are facing." Nicolat had never considered that they would assume the assassination attempt was aimed at him, as well as Amira. "The assassins wore the blue, green, and white Lysodanian colors, but it could be that King Sarzo is trying to make us believe that our allies in Lysodania orchestrated the attack," General Array continued. "King Mikroth has sent his concerns and blessings to our king, and he has sworn on his own children's lives that he has perpetrated no harm on our royal family." The general began pacing the room. "Of course, King Sarzo has also sent his blessings for the health of our royal family, sworn allegiance, and claims that his men were in no way involved. Your Majesty, I am more inclined to believe King Mikroth, as you know. He has nothing to gain from the loss of your children. He has more to gain from a union by marrying one of his daughters to Prince Nicolat." The king nodded. A familiar sickness roiled in Nicolat's stomach. It was the concern that he was being used more for breeding than royal leadership. "King Sarzo routinely gives shelter to our Belleron criminals," the general continued. "There are reports that Extellans are looting coastal towns and sinking fishing boats. Although we receive complaints from the fishing villages, it is never enough to start a war. However, if we suspect Exteli, as I do, even if we are wrong, taking over Exteli would solve multiple problems." "I agree with the general, your majesty," Captain Scar said. He was a second in command due to his length of time in the service of the king. He was a lean man with a scar that ran the length of his face. He used a lightweight sword and sharpened it so much that he had to sheath it in a metal case. "Exteli is small and would be easy to take," Scar continued. "We should hit them first. No one, not even King Mikroth, will mind. We hit quick and cause minimal casualties. The way Sarzo runs things, his people should welcome our rulership with open arms." Nicolat's mind started to wander as the men all congratulated themselves for agreeing with the general and his captain. What if they did take Exteli? Who would rule that country? They would have to send somebody over there. A new advantage to the original scheme began to grow in his mind. Perhaps Nicolat could be a ruler after all. Sure, it wouldn't be Belleron, but far away in Exteli, he wouldn't have to answer to anyone. "Besides, each prince will have some land to rule," Captain Scar continued, practically reading Nicolat's mind. Nick wanted to jump up and say yes, right then and there, but he bit his tongue. The king turned his eyes to Captain Davin. "What do you think?" he asked. Captain Davin was around the same age as Nicolat and always took a peaceful and thoughtful approach to situations. Nicolat wondered how such a man could be a captain. He was quiet and often wandered on the grounds alone, lost in thought. But Nicolat had also seen the man in battle. Captain Davin was a master. He never missed, and his first blow was always a deadly one. Captain Davin's eyes were sharp and crystal clear. If anyone could read the treason in Nicolat's eyes, the captain could. "Exteli is not a real threat," Captain Davin said in a voice so smooth you couldn't help but believe him. "They are smaller, their swordsmen are not as good. They feud amongst themselves. All we really need to do is heighten our security. Nicolot wondered about the chance of more assassins and if King Sarzo would want to use him again. Nick needed them to go to war in order to cover his true intentions. King Erasus let out a long sigh. I, too, am against a war, the king said. There are always lives lost. I wonder if such a battle is worth losing any of you. Nicolot watched as his brother, Bilex, reached out and placed a comforting hand on his father's shoulder. Captain Davin is right, Bilex said. They probably aren't a big enough threat to risk the lives. We would look like angry savages striking without any real evidence. The coward, Nicolot thought. He just doesn't want to get his pearly white fingers dirty. Bilex wore more jewels than his sister, and Nicolot knew for a fact that he hadn't gone to the practice hall in over 3 years. He stayed close to Erasus because the old man would protect him with his life, and Bilex wouldn't have to lift a finger. Nicolot and Bilex had never been close. Where Nicolot stood back and observed, Bilex was a social know-it-all, always shaking hands, smiling, and laughing to please others. Nicolot knew it was all just a front, and that his older brother was simply afraid to look like a fool in front of his father. Nicolot was taller, stronger, and could defeat his brother in any kind of fight, fist, sword, even a drag race. Lamone stirred beside Nicolot and cleared his throat to speak. Your Majesty, Lamone said. Nicolot curled his lip in disgust at having someone as low as Lamone addressing his father. I would like to agree with your decision against war with Exteli. Heightened security should be the first priority here. Nicolot was surprised and wondered what Lamone's new agenda might be. Lamone was the one who recruited Nicolot to help King Sarzo of Exteli instigate a war. Nicolot didn't care any more for King Sarzo's agenda. All he ever wanted was to rule his own kingdom. Since his mother had died, his father and brother had made it clear that Nicolot was the least important prince, with no true purpose but to perhaps marry into the Lycidanian kingdom or favor family. Nicolot was ready to take over his own destiny. Father, he said, standing to his feet, I believe that if we do not strike down Sarzo now and remove him from the throne of Exteli, that he will try to take the throne from you and from your children. Sarzo will try to scheme his way into this castle, maybe with more assassinations, successful ones. We can heighten security for years, and Sarzo will just keep pounding on the castle doors, trying to get in. He is an evil man, ruling over criminals. If we do not act now, in time, the kingdom of Bellerone may come to regret it. After a pause, the captains began to put in their support for Nicolot. Soon, the only men still opposed to the war were the king and Captain Davin. Erasus's eyes looked even more tired than they had at the beginning of the discussion. Nicolot thought he saw a sadness there. I suppose you are all right, King Erasus said. Putting a stop to Sarzo now is probably the best plan. For a moment, Nicolot felt guilty about pulling his father into war. But then he looked at Bilex, who had gone from his usual pearly white to a sickly ghost white. Nicolot was sure that if he were to look under the table, Bilex's knees would be shaking. The men discussed strategies for about an hour longer, and then everyone left the room, shaking hands or bowing on their way out. Lamone vanished quickly, but Nicolot was feeling too victorious to care. Back in his room, he wanted to talk to KaLeah, but he didn't know why. Nicolot wanted to celebrate, and in his rush of adrenaline, he found pen and paper and wrote a note to KaLeah. He sealed the note closed with wax and then called to a servant. Take this to favor KaLeah, he said to the shaking servant girl. She was maybe close to his sister's age, but she looked much older in the face. For good measure, he added, and if the seal is broken before it reaches her, I shall throw you to the dragon spirits in the forest. He laughed as her eyes popped open wide, and he shooed her on her way. KaLeah. Favor KaLeah? KaLeah nodded and then took the sealed note from the tiny servant girl. She looked relieved and quickly scampered away down the hall. KaLeah returned to sit across from Amira in the princess's room, where Amira was showing off her collection of porcelain dolls. "Open it," Amira said. "Who is it from? What does it say?" KaLeah broke the seal, confused and curious. "KaLeah," she read aloud, her own name sounding foreign on her lips. She saw the prince's name signed at the bottom. "It's from your brother. He says there will be war with Exteli. After a lengthy debate, my arguments for war won out over the others. KaLeah stopped. She scanned ahead in the note and then quickly tucked it away. "That's it," she said. "There's going to be a war." Amira's eyes lit up with both fear and excitement. "Will there be danger? Is it going to be here?" Amira asked, her voice shaking. "Perhaps, but all you need to do is hide in the secret passageway until I come to get you." She stood up and headed to her own room, through the door behind a tapestry woven with the image of a woman sitting near a pond. "What else does the letter say?" Amira asked, trying to follow KaLeah into her room. "Nothing," KaLeah said. "But there is more. You were about to read more. I want to hear everything that my brother said about the war. I'm not afraid." KaLeah didn't want to read the rest because it was not about the war. Nicolette wanted to see KaLeah in private. KaLeah squared her shoulders and looked down at the whiny princess. "I said there is nothing else, and you may not read the note," KaLeah said forcefully. Amira's eyes went a little wide for a moment, then narrowed defiantly at KaLeah. "You are hiding something," she said. "I know there is something you're not telling me." Amira danced around to block KaLeah's escape. "Does it have something to do with Nicolot? What does he want? I may be younger than you, but I'm not stupid, you know. You have been acting strange lately, and now you get a personal note from my brother. Why would he send you a note?" KaLeah looked at the note in her hands and ran a finger across the broken seal. Suddenly, feeling too exposed, she looked down at Amira. She assumed that the princess could order her to read the letter or call in the door guards to rip the note from her hands. With a sigh, KaLeah unfolded the note and began to read. "I cannot tell you what seeing you the other night meant to me," KaLeah read. "You saw my brother? Did you talk to him? Where were you?" KaLeah looked up and lifted her eyebrows in irritation. Amira sat back slightly. "Sorry, read on," she said. "I wish to see you again. We can talk of the war. Meet me in the ballroom at 11. I will be waiting. Prince Nicolot." "Do you love him? What if you marry him? Then we could be sisters, and you can be a princess. He must love you or something. I have never seen him with a girl. When did you talk to him? What did you talk about?" Amira kept rattling on, but KaLeah stopped listening. She didn't love Nicolot. At best, she hated him. "I'm not going to see him tonight. I do not love him, and I most definitely will never be a princess," she blurted out, interrupting Amira's cascade of questions. Amira looked stunned, and her eyes began to sparkle with tears. "What's wrong with being a princess?" she asked. KaLeah stared into the hearth, watching the fire. She felt a little guilty that the princess had picked up on the snide tone in her comment. It wasn't as if Amira had chosen to be a princess, any more than she had chosen to be a village girl. "There is nothing wrong with being a princess, Amira. Of course. It is just that you were born to be one, and I was not." "Many women who are not born princesses marry into royal families," the little girl countered. "Yes, but those women are born to be spoiled, elitist, entitled, rich, snobs who love fancy dresses and jewelry," she thought to herself while she mulled over how to respond. "They are not born farmers or villagers who learned how to fight and plant and hunt and fish. They're different from me. They are born to be favors and friends to royalty." "Well, you are a favor now," Amira added smartly. "I am merely a bodyguard who wears a fancy dress when commanded." KaLeah smiled down warmly. "Well, then I command you to put on a dress and go meet with my brother." Princess Amira stood up a little straighter. "You can gather more information from him regarding this war with Exteli. Should we be afraid? Is father going to leave the castle? Is it Exteli who have been trying to kidnap me? You must go and find these things out and report back to me." Amira's command gave KaLeah a mixed feeling of annoyance, curiosity, and nervous excitement. The longer she sat with those feelings, the harder it was for her to determine if she was more annoyed or more excited. She finally nodded in agreement, and Mira squealed, darting off toward KaLeah's wardrobe. The princess chose a silky, long black dress for her to wear later that night. Trying it on, she refused to pin on the favor pendant, finding it unnecessary. Amira brushed out KaLeah's long hair so that it flowed down the back of her dress and tickled her through the fabric. Amira giggled about the romantic nature of it all, and then KaLeah changed back into her gray tunic. "Let's go kill time in the armory throwing daggers," she said. The girls enjoyed hours of practice and a large dinner before heading back to their room. KaLeah sat with Amira until she fell asleep, and then dressed herself in the black dress. She felt like one of Amira's dolls as she walked to the ballroom later that night. The ballroom was dark, and she drifted like a shadow across the expanse of space. She stopped to wait by a large statue of a Nala dragon, carved from black stone. The Nala race of dragons had inhabited Naldash after the planet was divided. They were flying dragons with scales that changed between shades of blue, purple, and black so they could fly camouflaged in the skies. The tapestries always depicted them with long dark wings. The statue reminded her of her dreams. There had been both kinds of dragons in her dreams. The Dynak race had supposedly lived on the planet Denlarak. They were the land race, running and burrowing with smaller wings. The phantom dragon she had seen in the woods looked more like a combination of the two, or a race completely separate. "Why do I see you?" she asked the statue. "Why do I dream of you and your extinct ancestors all the time?" She realized that the dreams were probably the result of being surrounded by more depictions of dragons she had ever seen in her entire life. She rolled her eyes at the statue and turned away from it, silently blaming it for her nightmares. There were no tables or chairs in the great ballroom, just a big open floor and a high vaulted ceiling. Moonlight twinkled in from high windows, casting shadows across the floor and walls. After a few minutes, she heard boot heels on the floor. She couldn't see him, but she knew it was Nicolot. He seemed almost flow across the floor, like a dragon stalking a meal. She watched as he went to the middle of the floor and spun on one heel in a full circle, as if dancing with himself. She heard him light a match, and soon she saw the candle in his hand. The light made his features leap from his face and into the darkness again and again. KaLeah took a deep breath, stood up straight, and slowly walked out from beside the dragon statue. Nicolot turned and watched her, but she couldn't tell what he was thinking by the look on his face. He seemed to be smiling slightly. "You take my breath away," he said. KaLeah stopped walking and just looked at him. "I'm here to talk about the war," KaLeah said, crossing her arms. She wanted to be clear about being ordered to be there. "Of course," Nicolot said. He looked over the dress she was wearing and said, "The war, of course." He put the candle on the floor and then walked to KaLeah, drawing nearer as if his words to her would be sacred. "We are going to attack Exteli. Take it over, and I will rule that kingdom," Nicolot said. "I am the one who convinced all of my father's men to pursue this war, and it will be a historic victory. There has not been a war this important in a long time." She knew little of wars that happened before she was born. "It is so good to see you," Nicolot said. "I'm excited about the war, and I knew that you would be the only one who could understand my excitement." He slowly reached out a hand and touched KaLeah's bare arm. His fingers were cold, and she shuddered, but didn't turn away. "Please don't touch me," she said, barely able to hear her own voice as all Princess Amira's questions vanished from her mind. He looked hurt and pulled his hand back. With more effort than she would want to admit to herself, she turned around toward the statue, dead set to leave him then and there. "Good luck, Prince," she said. "Thanks for the information." "KaLeah, stop!" Nicolot yelled. His voice bounced off the walls and echoed across the ballroom. KaLeah froze, and for a moment she was frightened. She instinctively thought of the dagger securely fastened to her inner thigh. "If you do one thing for me, I will leave you alone," he said. "I will forget the way I feel about you." He's lying, she told herself. He sounded like an animal caught in a trap, calling for help, but only drawing another victim into the trap with him. "You are surprisingly beautiful and a complete mystery to me," Nicolot said. He stepped up behind her and put his hands on her waist. A twinge of excitement streamed through her body. He moved one hand up to her ear and pushed back a few strands of hair. His fingers were soft against her skin, and she gulped back an involuntary verbal protest. "Kiss me once, and I'll leave you alone," he whispered. He put his hands on her shoulders and began to slowly turn her around. She found herself pushing and pulling at the same time. Her heart struggled against her mind as it tried to shout out warnings. Hadn't he put a knife to my throat in the passageway? Hadn't he offered to give me to Lamode as a plaything? Is this man good or bad? She wondered. There was a strength and yet a tender passion emanating from his fingertips and into her shoulders. There was an energy surging from him, and somehow she knew he felt that same energy, a spiritual connection between them. Face to face with Nicolot, KaLeah looked deep into his eyes, which seemed to be black in the dark ballroom. He was a beautiful man, with smooth, creamy skin and a smile that spread like a river across his face. His hand tightly cupped around the back of her neck. He pulled her firmly and steered her mouth closer to his. Her heart was on fire, beating so fast she felt the pulse in her throat and fingers. She had never been kissed, never even held a boy's hand before this moment. He lightly pressed his lips against hers. She kept her eyes open, distrusting the man she hardly knew. He started to kiss her harder, and she felt like she was falling. She lost control of her eyes, and they finally shut, giving in to the swirl of emotions. She was swimming in a dark pool of the most amazing excitement she'd ever experienced. Her bones ached with passion, and she knew it was all over. Somehow, she had lost something. She would be vulnerable now. Her mind was only focused on Nicolot, and she realized her hands were raised and moving around his arms and his back. She was kissing the prince back. The whispers that had been haunting her came upon her again, creeping into her mind slowly, prodding the edges of her consciousness, and then getting louder until it was as if they were in the room and all around her. The whispers and growls seemed to grow in numbers and volume until finally KaLeah's ears were hurting. She didn't want the excitement of the kiss to end, but it seemed that the voices in her head had a different opinion. She let Nicolot pull her in closer, just as the sounds were becoming screams and what she thought sounded like roaring, as if from animals or possibly dragons. Suddenly, a real sound rocked her back and away from Nicolot. The ringing in her ears was gone and replaced by a low-pitched ringing of bells all along the outside of the castle. KaLeah looked at Nicolot, who looked just as stunned as she was. "An attack," he said. That was all he had to say. KaLeah was out of the ballroom and running through the candlelit hallways, up the stairs, to Amira.